Late November 1944. High above western Germany, the sky is thin and metallic, stretched taut by cold air and contrails. A lone Messerschmitt Bf 109 climbs unevenly, its engine carefully throttled, every unnecessary movement avoided. Inside the cockpit, the fuel gauge sits lower than it should. It almost always does now. Below, the landscape is gray and scarred. Rail yards shattered, refineries blackened, rivers crossed by broken bridges. Ahead, the horizon fills with aircraft. Not dozens, hundreds. American bombers move in long, disciplined streams, their formations layered and steady. Around them, fighters weave with casual confidence, circling, diving, climbing again. They do not appear to worry about distance or time. The German pilot watches in disbelief. These enemy aircraft have crossed an ocean, crossed a continent, and now patrol the sky as if fuel were limitless. He knows how many minutes he can afford in the air. He knows how carefully each mission is calculated back at base, and he knows that what he is seeing should not be possible, not this late in the war. Yet the formations keep coming, wave after wave, engines roaring without restraint. What confronts him in that moment is not just enemy air power, but something deeper, an imbalance born far from the battlefield, forged long before this winter morning. By late 1944, the Second World War had become a contest not just of armies and weapons, but of endurance. The initial years had been shaped by speed, surprise, and tactical daring. Now the war was decided by systems, by who could replace losses, sustain operations, and feed machines that consumed resources at an unprecedented rate. At the center of this struggle was fuel. Modern warfare ran on petroleum. Tanks, trucks, ships, aircraft, every movement depended on refined oil. Aviation fuel, especially high-octane gasoline, was among the most complex and fragile products of the entire war economy. It required specialized refineries, chemical additives, and uninterrupted transport. Without it, even the most advanced aircraft became inert metal. Germany entered the war acutely vulnerable in this regard. The Reich possessed no significant domestic oil reserves. Before 1939, it relied heavily on imports, particularly from Romania's Ploiești oil fields, and on synthetic fuel produced from coal through hydrogenation plants. These facilities were technological achievements, but they were costly, energy-intensive, and difficult to protect. From the beginning, German planners understood that fuel would be a limiting factor. They gambled that rapid victories would prevent it from becoming decisive. By 1944, that gamble had failed. Across the Atlantic, the United States stood in stark contrast. American oil production dwarfed that of every other nation combined. Texas, California, Oklahoma, and Louisiana pumped crude in volumes that reshaped global logistics. In 1944 alone, the United States produced roughly 2/3 of the world's oil. Refineries operated around the clock, pipelines stretched across states, tankers crossed oceans in organized convoys. Fuel was not merely available, it was abundant. This industrial advantage translated directly into air power. The U.S. Army Air Forces and the Royal Air Force could plan operations without calculating whether aviation gasoline should be saved for tomorrow. Long-range missions became routine. Fighter escorts could loiter. Training programs ran continuously. Pilots flew until instinct replaced hesitation. Germany's situation moved in the opposite direction. Beginning in 1943, Allied strategists increasingly targeted the Reich's fuel infrastructure. Synthetic fuel plants at Luna, Merseburg, and elsewhere became priority targets. Ploiești was bombed repeatedly. Rail networks that moved fuel from refineries to airfields were systematically attacked. By the summer of 1944, the effects were undeniable. Production plummeted. Storage depots emptied faster than they could be refilled. The Luftwaffe felt the impact immediately. Aviation fuel allocations were slashed, training flights were curtailed or canceled altogether. New pilots arrived at frontline units with dangerously low flight hours, sometimes fewer than 100, barely enough to master basic flight, let alone combat against experienced Allied airmen. Veteran pilots found themselves grounded for days at a time, waiting for fuel that never came. Meanwhile, Allied air forces expanded their operational reach. American heavy bombers, B-17s and B-24s, now flew daily deep into German airspace. With the introduction of long-range escort fighters like the P-51 Mustang, bombers no longer faced German interceptors alone. The escorts could follow them from takeoff to target and back again, burning fuel at rates the Luftwaffe could scarcely imagine affording. This was not simply a matter of numbers, it was a structural imbalance. Where German commanders counted leaders, Allied planners counted squadrons. Where German pilots were ordered to conserve fuel even in combat, American pilots were encouraged to stay aggressive, to press attacks, to remain airborne until the mission was complete. The skies reflected this disparity. Continuous Allied presence became the norm. Interception became a desperate, short-window effort. By late 1944, fuel shortages were no longer a logistical concern in Germany. They were an operational reality shaping every decision. And in the cockpit, where gauges dipped toward empty long before battles were decided, pilots understood this truth more clearly than anyone. That understanding would only deepen as the war pressed into its final winter. As the fuel crisis tightened its grip, the Luftwaffe's decline accelerated in ways that statistics alone could not capture. Air combat is a discipline built on repetition. Mastery comes from hours in the air, learning how an aircraft behaves at the edge of a stall, how it responds under fire, how quickly a pilot can recognize danger and act without conscious thought. By late 1944, Germany no longer had the fuel to support this process. Flight schools reduced curricula again and again. Basic training was compressed. Advanced combat instruction, once considered essential, became a luxury. Night flying, formation practice, gunnery exercises, each required fuel that could not be spared. Instructors, themselves veterans of earlier campaigns, watched standards fall but had no means to correct them. New pilots were rushed through programs designed for peacetime constraints, then sent directly into skies dominated by enemy aircraft. This erosion of experience reshaped Luftwaffe units from within. Veteran pilots carried an increasing burden, tasked with protecting bomb-damaged cities while mentoring inexperienced wingmen who would barely learn to survive. The imbalance was fatal. Novices were lost quickly, often before firing a shot. Veterans, forced to compensate, flew more frequently but with ever tighter fuel restrictions. Even successful sorties were followed by uncertainty, whether there would be enough fuel for the next mission or any mission at all. On the ground, the contrast with Allied airfields was stark. American bases in Britain and on the European continent functioned as industrial hubs. Fuel arrived by pipeline, rail, and tanker, distributed in volumes that allowed operations to proceed regardless of weather or losses. Aircraft were refueled as a matter of routine, not deliberation. Training squadrons continued to fly stateside and overseas, producing a steady stream of pilots who arrived with hundreds of flight hours already logged. This abundance shaped doctrine. Allied pilots were trained to think expansively, to engage aggressively, to pursue targets, to extend missions when opportunities appeared. Fuel planning assumed margin, not scarcity. A P-51 pilot escorting bombers over Germany could loiter near targets, search for enemy aircraft, and still return safely. That freedom translated directly into air superiority. Germany, by contrast, was forced into a defensive crouch. Interception windows were calculated down to minutes. Fighters took off late to save fuel, climbing rapidly but with little room for maneuver once combat began. Dogfights were shortened or avoided entirely.
Disengagement was often ordered not because of tactical necessity, but because fuel gauges dictated it. By the autumn of 1944, even elite units felt the strain. Jet aircraft like the Me-262, technologically superior on paper, were hamstrung by fuel shortages in limited pilot training. The promise of revolutionary weapons could not overcome the basic requirement of sustained operations. Without fuel, innovation stalled. German commanders recognized the problem but lacked solutions. Synthetic fuel production could not recover under constant bombing. Romania's oil fields were effectively neutralized. Transport networks lay in ruins. Every decision became a compromise: divert fuel to fighters defending the Reich or to ground forces struggling to hold collapsing fronts. In the air, the contrast was visible. Allied aircraft appeared everywhere at all hours. Patrols overlapped. Bombing campaigns continued without pause. For German pilots, the sky itself seemed occupied, controlled by an enemy that did not fear running dry. It was in this environment of shrinking margins and relentless pressure that encounters between German and American airmen took on a new significance. The disparity was no longer abstract. It was measured in minutes aloft, in missions aborted, in engines silenced too early. That realization set the stage for the moments when disbelief gave way to understanding and understanding to resignation.
For German pilots in late 1944, the fuel gauge became as threatening as any enemy aircraft. It dictated decisions in ways that training manuals never anticipated. Each mission began with calculation rather than confidence. Pilots knew before takeoff how long they could remain airborne and how little margin existed for error. Combat instincts were suppressed by arithmetic. A prolonged chase, a vertical climb, even a hard turn could mean failing to reach home. This constant awareness altered behavior in the air. Engagements were brief and cautious. Opportunities were assessed not by tactical advantage, but by fuel consumption. Younger pilots learned fear not only of enemy guns, but of empty tanks. The psychological strain was relentless. Men who had once fought with initiative now flew defensively, aware that survival depended as much on restraint as on skill. On paper, many German fighters remained formidable. The Bf-109 and Fw-190 were still capable aircraft, and newer designs promised even greater performance. But technology divorced from logistics offered little comfort. High-performance engines consumed fuel rapidly. Emergency power settings, once used freely, became forbidden except in extremis. Aircraft could no longer be flown at their full potential because the fuel to support such performance simply did not exist. Meanwhile, American aircraft were designed and operated with endurance in mind. Drop tanks extended range. Engines were run hard when needed, with little concern for reserves. The same sky hosted machines with similar speeds and armament, yet only one side could exploit those qualities fully. The Luftwaffe's training crisis was not merely a matter of numbers, it reshaped combat dynamics. Inexperienced pilots entered battles already at a disadvantage, facing enemies who had flown hundreds of hours in training and combat alike. Fuel shortages meant fewer practice flights, fewer chances to correct mistakes before they became fatal. Learning occurred in combat under conditions that allowed no margin for error. American pilots, by contrast, arrived in Europe prepared for sustained operations. Training emphasized repetition, confidence, and adaptability. They were accustomed to long flights, extended engagements, and returning with fuel still in reserve. This disparity translated into composure. In the chaos of combat, calm often proved decisive. Together, these human, technological, and training factors intertwined, creating an air war where imbalance was felt not only in numbers, but in mindset. The consequences of that imbalance would become even clearer when viewed from the other side of the cockpit. From the American perspective, fuel was not a constraint,
but a given. The scale of the United States petroleum infrastructure defied European comprehension. Oil flowed from domestic fields to refineries, then onward through pipelines, rail cars, and tankers with industrial regularity. Aviation gasoline arrived at airfields faster than it could be consumed. Storage tanks brimmed. Supply officers planned not around scarcity, but around scheduling. This abundance functioned as a weapon in itself. Continuous operations were possible because logistics never faltered. When weather grounded aircraft one day, missions resumed the next without hesitation. Losses were absorbed. Aircraft and crews were replaced. Fuel ensured that air power remained constant, relentless, and predictable in its pressure. Fuel abundance reshaped how the Allies fought in the air. American fighters were not tethered tightly to bases or schedules. Escort missions extended far beyond previous limits. Pilots could patrol above bomber formations, search for threats, and pursue retreating enemies without immediate concern for return distance. Time aloft became a tactical asset. German pilots noticed this freedom immediately. Allied fighters seemed to appear everywhere, lingering over targets long after bombers had passed. There was no sense of urgency in their movements, no visible need to disengage. They controlled altitude, timing, and engagement range. Fuel allowed them to choose when to fight and when not to. Abundance also shaped morale. American pilots flew with the expectation of return. Fuel was part of that confidence. The knowledge that reserves existed, both in tanks and in the system supporting them, reduced hesitation. Aggression felt sustainable. Risk was calculated, not desperate. For German pilots, the opposite was true. Each takeoff carried uncertainty. The awareness of limited fuel undermined confidence and eroded morale over time. Combat became an exercise in survival rather than dominance. Even successful missions felt temporary, overshadowed by the knowledge that conditions were worsening. By late 1944, these angles converged. Industrial might, operational freedom, and psychological assurance combined to produce an air presence that felt inexhaustible. For those facing it from the Luftwaffe's side, the realization was sobering. The war in the air was no longer a contest of aircraft alone. It was a confrontation with a system that could not be outflown, outlasted, or outrun. And that truth would become undeniable in the months when the imbalance reached its breaking point. By the autumn of 1944, the air war over Europe entered a decisive phase. The front lines on the ground shifted daily, but in the sky, control had already been decided. The Luftwaffe still existed, still fought, still claimed victories, but it no longer dictated the terms of battle. Fuel shortages reached critical levels in September. Synthetic production collapsed under sustained bombing. Emergency reserves were diverted from training units to frontline squadrons, then from frontline squadrons to elite formations, until even those allocations became symbolic. Some units received fuel sufficient for only a handful of sorties per week. Others were grounded entirely, aircraft lined along runways like museum pieces rather than weapons. Meanwhile, Allied air activity intensified. American bomber streams crossed German airspace with increasing regularity, often escorted by layers of fighters at different altitudes. P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts roamed freely, attacking airfields, rail yards, and transport columns. They returned repeatedly, sometimes striking the same targets multiple times in a single day. Fuel allowed persistence. Persistence eroded resistance. German interception tactics grew increasingly desperate. Fighters took off only when bomber formations were confirmed, often too late to gain optimal altitude. Engagements were rushed. Pilots were ordered to break off combat early, not because the enemy had disengaged, but because fuel calculations demanded it. The concept of sustained defense disappeared.
It was during these months that German pilots began to grasp the scale of Allied reserves through direct observation. They encountered enemy fighters far from expected ranges, still aggressive, still maneuvering freely. American aircraft appeared over German bases minutes after takeoff, loitering with apparent indifference to distance. For pilots accustomed to counting minutes, this behavior was shocking. Reports filtered upward through the chain of command. Luftwaffe intelligence officers noted the continuous presence of Allied fighters. Squadron leaders remarked on enemy endurance. Pilots spoke openly of fuel as the true enemy. The contrast between what Germany could afford and what the Allies expended casually became impossible to ignore. The imbalance affected not just combat, but perception. German airmen, once proud of technical superiority and tactical innovation, now faced an adversary whose strength lay in sustainability. They could win individual encounters, but never enough of them. Every victory felt hollow, quickly offset by the next wave of attackers. As winter approached, the Luftwaffe prepared for one last effort to alter the course of the air war. Plans were drawn with optimism on paper, but with fuel shortages etched into every margin. The stage was set for a final confrontation, one that would expose, beyond doubt, how deeply the war had already been decided. The final proof came not in a single battle, but in repeated encounters that stripped away illusion. Late 1944 offered no moment of surprise, no sudden reversal, only accumulation. Each day in the air reinforced the same conclusion. German pilots described meeting American fighters deep over the Reich, far from the coast, long after bomber formations had passed. The escorts remained. They circled, hunted, and waited. To men trained under strict fuel rationing, this behavior defied logic. It suggested reserves beyond calculation, an enemy unconcerned with return distance, engine hours, or consumption rates. Operational records confirm the reality behind the perception. American fighter units routinely flew missions exceeding 6 hours. Drop tanks were discarded and replaced without hesitation. Refueling schedules supported continuous sorties. Losses did not interrupt tempo. When one unit stood down, another took its place. The sky never emptied. For the Luftwaffe, the same period was defined by scarcity. Missions were canceled for lack of fuel. Pilots took off with minimal reserves, sometimes instructed to land at alternate fields because primary bases had been bombed or could no longer supply fuel. Emergency landings increased. Aircraft were abandoned not due to damage, but because tanks ran dry. The psychological impact was profound. German pilots realized that even if they conserved fuel perfectly, even if they avoided unnecessary combat, the strategic equation would not change. They were outmatched not by bravery or skill, but by depth, by an industrial system that could sustain pressure indefinitely. By December 1944, this understanding permeated the Luftwaffe. It appeared in after-action reports, in unit diaries, in private reflections recorded later in captivity. Fuel, once a logistical detail, emerged as the decisive factor in the air war. No maneuver could compensate for its absence. No innovation could overcome its loss. The turning point was complete when this truth became undeniable. Air superiority belonged to the side that could afford to stay aloft, and Germany no longer could. From that moment forward, the Luftwaffe's role shifted from defense to endurance, fighting on, not in expectation of victory, but out of obligation. The war in the air had been settled, even as the war itself continued. What followed was not sudden collapse, but an unraveling whose consequences would shape the final months of the conflict. The effects of the fuel imbalance unfolded steadily through the final months of the war. By early 1945, the Luftwaffe could no longer contest Allied air operations in any meaningful way. Aircraft still took to the skies, but in ever smaller numbers, often too late, too briefly, and at too great a cost to matter strategically. Statistics tell part of the story. Sortie rates declined sharply. Units that once flew daily missions now flew weekly, if at all. Aircraft losses increasingly occurred on takeoff or landing, the result of hurried training and deteriorating airfield conditions. The loss of experienced pilots became irreversible. There were no reserves to replace them, not in men, not in machines, and certainly not in fuel. On the ground, the consequences were immediate and devastating. Allied aircraft operated with near impunity. Rail lines were cut repeatedly, delaying troop movements and supply deliveries. Armored formations were attacked before reaching the front. Columns were broken apart from the air, their movements observed and struck at will. Fuel shortages compounded these problems, immobilizing vehicles that survived air attack but could not be resupplied. German ground commanders increasingly reported that air power, not enemy armor, dictated the pace of operations. The inability to move by day forced night marches that slowed advances and exhausted troops. Defensive positions could not be reinforced in time. Retreats turned into routes under constant aerial harassment. Meanwhile, Allied air forces expanded their missions. With fuel and air superiority assured, they shifted seamlessly between strategic bombing, close air support, and interdiction. Aircraft flew multiple roles in rapid succession. The system adapted effortlessly, its flexibility sustained by logistics that never faltered. German attempts to respond through dispersal, camouflage, or last-minute technological deployments failed to reverse the trend. Without fuel, such measures were symbolic. Aircraft hidden in forests still required gasoline to fly. Jets parked on runways still needed trained pilots and sustained supply. By the war's final phase, the Luftwaffe existed largely on paper. Its presence in the sky was sporadic, its impact marginal. The realization that fuel had been the decisive factor became unavoidable. What German pilots had sensed in late 1944 now defined the conflict as a whole. The imbalance did not end with the war's conclusion. It shaped how victory and defeat were understood in its aftermath. When the fighting ended, the scale of the imbalance became fully visible. Captured documents, post-war analyses, and the testimony of surviving commanders all pointed to the same conclusion. Germany had not simply lost the air war through inferior aircraft or tactics, it had lost because it could not sustain flight. Luftwaffe officers questioned after the war spoke candidly. Many emphasized that by 1944, operational planning had become theoretical. Units existed on strength reports but lacked the fuel to function. Pilots were available, aircraft were present, but sorties could not be flown. In some cases, fuel allocations were measured in fractions of what was required for a single mission. Defense of the Reich had become a matter of appearance rather than capability. Allied analysts reached similar conclusions from the opposite perspective. American post-war studies highlighted petroleum logistics as a central pillar of victory. Oil production, refinery output, and transportation networks were recognized as strategic weapons equal to bombers and tanks. The ability to train pilots thoroughly, fly continuously, and replace losses without interruption proved decisive. German fuel shortages also reshaped how air combat itself was remembered. Veteran pilots recalled that by late 1944, combat decisions were dictated less by enemy action than by the fuel gauge. Engagements ended not when tactics demanded it, but when endurance ran out. The psychological burden of this reality lingered long after the war. For the Allies, abundance became an assumption rather than an achievement. The systems that delivered fuel so reliably were rarely visible to those at the front, yet they underpinned every success. Aircraft that seemed unstoppable in the sky were only as effective as the pipelines, tankers, and refineries supporting them thousands of miles away. The lesson was clear and enduring. Industrial warfare had reached a stage where battles were decided long before the first aircraft took off. The skies over Germany in late 1944 were shaped by decisions made in oil fields, factories, and planning offices far from the front. As historians assessed the air war, fuel emerged not as a background factor, but as a defining force, one that determined who could fight, how long, and at what cost. That realization leads naturally to a broader reflection, beyond victory and defeat, on how modern war reshaped the meaning of power itself. In the end, the skies over Europe did not belong to the fastest aircraft or the bravest pilots alone. They belonged to endurance, to the quiet certainty that engines would start tomorrow and the day after that, and for as long as the war demanded. For German pilots in late 1944, the realization was unsettling. They faced an enemy whose strength was not always visible in a single dogfight, but revealed over hours and days, fighters that never seemed to leave, bombers that returned no matter how many were shot down. What astonished them was not American aggression, but American persistence. Fuel made that persistence possible. The air war exposed a fundamental shift in how conflicts were decided. Individual skill still mattered, courage still mattered, but they operated within systems larger than any one person. When those systems failed, even the most capable pilots found themselves grounded, constrained, or sent into combat already defeated by circumstance. For the Allies, fuel was rarely spoken of in heroic terms. It lacked the drama of aerial combat or the symbolism of victory parades. Yet it was fuel that allowed training to continue, missions to expand, and pressure to remain unbroken. It turned air superiority from a temporary advantage into a permanent condition. The legacy of late 1944 lies in this quiet truth. Modern war is won not only at the front, but in the structures that sustain it, in refineries and pipelines, in logistics charts and production schedules, in the unseen assurance that tomorrow's missions can be flown without hesitation. High above Germany, as engines burned freely on one side and sparingly on the other, that truth became undeniable. And in that realization, the outcome of the war in the air was sealed long before the final shots were fired.